After a bit of a delay, we had a changeable conditions race in Monaco, offering just what this track needs to make it interesting. It was well worth the wait, as at one point we had drivers on slicks, intermediates, and wet tyres at the same time. It was a great strategy from Perez though, as he and Red Bull got the strategy right and ensured they got past the Ferraris in Monaco. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Monaco Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. A fascinating strategy race. Once the race got underway, it was awesome to watch the drivers trying to make the right decisions when it comes to which tyre they wanted, as the track conditions changed throughout the Grand Prix. And it was this wet to dry race that was brilliant to watch, with faster cars stuck behind the runners that opted to try and hold on to their wet weather tyres until they were ready for slicks. And at Monaco, that's where it gets more difficult, as the teams don't want to lose track position and get stuck behind these drivers that had not yet stopped. Early on, you had Pierre Gasly making the call to switch to intermediates so that he could gamble on his strategy and find a way to get himself up the order after a disappointing qualifying on Saturday. And then you had drivers up and down the order trying their hardest to get themselves past with a single dry racing line and walls so close either side. There was a debate over whether the drivers could get themselves into a gap and get some quick running in and make the most of the tyres they'd just switched onto. It meant there was a real debate over whether the best strategy was to go from the wet tyre to the intermediate and then change to the slicks, or whether it was better to wait on the wet tyres to switch to the slicks straight away. It seemed like it all depended on where the drivers were running and where they would come out of the pits. It was a huge call for the teams, and ultimately it was Red Bull that came out on top on this occasion, and Leclerc was a big loser out at the front as he stopped twice in just a handful of laps and failed to gain the advantage of running on the intermediates. Hence he dropped from 1st to 4th, as it seems like his Monaco curse has continued. There were some drivers that seemed more confident than others in their strategies. Carlos Sainz made the call early to say he would want to make only one pit stop to go straight onto the slicks, and he just lost out to Sergio Pérez in the end, which meant he held on to P2. But it was touch and go there for a moment as he was being heavily chased down by the Red Bulls as they were on the second stint, who went for that intermediate option. On the whole, it was the overcut that was working generally speaking, and so it was foolish of Ferrari as they called Leclerc in for slicks at the same time as Sainz, before changing their minds just as the Monegasque driver entered the pit lane. But more on that later. It was the conditions that made this Monaco race just so exciting for us fans. Of course, it was difficult to follow, but we didn't know who would end up coming out on top throughout the Grand Prix. So for me, I think it has to be a green box for the changeable conditions and race strategies, as although the race was indeed cut short, there was something interesting going on throughout, even with different strategies after the mid-race red flag. Confusion from race control. Monaco is not exactly the best of tracks for racing. The walls are so very close, and as such it tends to be much better for qualifying than the race itself. But something that can change that is wet weather. And that's exactly what arrived at the starting time of the Grand Prix, as the rain fell just minutes before lights out. Understandably, the race control gave the team some additional time to give them an opportunity to change away from their slick tyres to a wet compound. And this is something that was necessary for all teams, as it would have been absolute chaos if they'd have been driving on the slick tyres in the rain. However, what happened next was nothing but confusing. The race control declared that the teams would start the formation lap behind the safety car, which would have meant that there was no choice but to start on the full wet tyres. This took away some of the potential excitement off the start and a bit of strategy, as the teams could have gambled on the unpredictable weather conditions and where they would change next. The FIA made the decision based on the fact that there was a potential heavy downpour on the way, which did indeed arrive, but they also added the fact that there hadn't been any wet running this weekend. But even so, these are some of the best racing drivers in the world, so I would have thought that they should be able to have trust in these drivers' abilities to start a race in those conditions. Later on, there was a red flag after a few formation laps as the weather conditions worsened, but it could have made for a great opening 15 minutes of the Grand Prix, in my opinion, and that may well have just meant that they might have finished the race instead. Sure, it was too wet once the initial red flag was called, but it could have been a pause in the Grand Prix rather than before the race had even started. Monaco does offer a unique scenario with the weather conditions, as there is the tunnel section of the track which will have been relatively dry and a hugely different section of track which could have impacted the drivers through the race. But for me, that just makes it more exciting at a track that's traditionally not the best for racing. But even during the red flag period, there was no urgency to get going again, even if the rain had subsided. I thought Martin Brundle put it perfectly on the Sky commentary as he said that these things happen. Rain comes unexpectedly. Had it arrived halfway through the race, then the drivers would have had to learn on the go, regardless of the running over the rest of the weekend. Plus, the fans have come to see the best drivers in the world, so they should absolutely be entitled to see these drivers handle these conditions. It was poorly managed and very risk-averse. The sport has a set of wet weather tyres, and it just feels like these weren't even given the chance, and that ultimately resulted in a delayed race start, which I don't think was too necessary on this occasion. What's really interesting is that there was reportedly a disagreement between the two race directors to determine the starting procedure, showing not only their inexperience but also a risk that disagreement could impact other potential incidents. Should there be a controversial crash, let's say, there could be a disagreement which may slow down a decision which has got to be a concern, and perhaps we saw that with the Esteban Ocon penalty later in the race. So it's a red box for the FIA for a poorly managed situation on this occasion to get this race underway. Rain happens in Formula 1, and for me, it's the driver's job to deal with that. Before we take a look at the Ferrari strategy errors today, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. YouTube is telling me that just 20% of the people watching my videos are subscribed to the channel. So if you haven't already, please help me reach 50,000 subscribers by the summer break. Thanks. Perez picks up the pieces. It was Sergio Pérez that potentially lost out on a Grand Prix victory last weekend in Spain, after team orders meant he had to concede the lead to Verstappen. And through the weekend in Monaco, he seemed to be the driver that was performing best for the Red Bull outfit. Of course, he lost out with the final Q3 lap incident, but regardless, he was the Red Bull driver in third on the grid and ahead of Verstappen. And so in the race where Red Bull put their drivers on the strongest strategy, it was Perez that took advantage and managed to drag himself up the order. After the red flag, Perez was arguably fortunate that the race directors decided to have a rolling start rather than a standing one. He then did incredibly well to manage that to the end and control his pace to maximise his results and come home with a rebound victory in Monaco. His defensive driving was also on show once again as he ensured that there weren't more laps as the timer counted down, as well as managing the gap to Carlos Sainz just behind him, who had the more durable tyres. It was redemption for Perez as he came back after the disappointment of last week in Spain, and he immediately came back to the top to prove that he should be considered a title contender in this championship. Both Red Bull drivers are capable of getting to the top, and he really deserved it after his performances so far in 2022. He finds himself just 6 points behind Leclerc and a third place finish behind his teammate. So of course, it's got to be a green box for Sergio Perez after an awesome result. Ferrari strategy mistakes. The Charles Leclerc home race curse has struck again for the Monegasque driver as he looked mighty after qualifying on Saturday and could have taken pole by a huge margin had he been able to complete his final qualifying lap. But his team let him down with the strategy on Sunday after the Red Bulls went for the intermediate and then onto slicks approach, but also got the overcut on the lead Ferrari driver, which meant both Red Bulls were able to overtake him in those second stops. It was a tough one for Leclerc, who perhaps didn't dictate the strategy enough compared to his teammate, who made the call much earlier on to switch from the wets to the dries without taking on the intermediate tyre. It was a good call for Sainz in the end, but Ferrari just didn't seem to be convinced, and it took time to let Sainz switch onto that approach instead. It was a difficult situation for the team and all the teams on track, but it just felt like Red Bull were far more on top of the situation throughout this race. It was the kind of strategy call, or rather lack of strategy calls, we saw for Sebastian Vettel with that team back in 2020, where Ferrari almost seemed to ignore the German driver as they never seemed to offer him the optimum strategy. When competing for a world championship where the cars are close on track, it's critical to get these kinds of decisions right, and for Ferrari, they don't seem to be competing well with Red Bull from a strategic perspective this year. Admittedly, it was a difficult situation for all the teams, but these setups have huge swathes of people working back at the factory, and there were plenty of drivers competing with the different tyre compounds that could have been used as a benchmark. I'm sure the Ferrari team were doing this, but it's as if they didn't get the fact that the overcut was the way to go on Sunday. As for Leclerc, well, 4th position in Monaco after a dominant performance on Saturday can only be deemed to be a failure. So it was a tough situation, but even though it was his first Monaco finish in F1, he still dropped back in the championship standings. So for me, I think Ferrari let Leclerc down in this race, and so I think they deserve a red box. They were better with Sainz, but even that took some convincing. The Tech Pro barriers hold up again. I want to talk about the fact that the Tech Pro barrier installed at the swimming pool chicane was absolutely vital today with Schumacher's crash. It was a huge incident which saw the young German driver's car split into two, just as it did in Jeddah, showing the fact that the safety system is working. Fortunately, the driver was able to walk away from the incident, which is truly remarkable given the size of that accident. For me, it's part of a wider conversation with Mick Schumacher this season. He just seems to be struggling with his 2022 Haas car, particularly when compared with Kevin Magnussen. The trouble is that as the Haas car has lost its advantage compared to its rivals, I think the opportunity to score points will become more and more limited. Fundamentally, to finish a race in the points, first you must finish, and I think we're seeing more errors from Schumacher as the pressure has increased on the 23-year-old. I'm so happy he was able to walk away from that incident, and so for me, I think it's got to be a green box for the Tech Pro barrier setup at this track. It may be a dangerous circuit, but the safety systems in place are truly incredible and so well designed. Honourable mentions. I think Fernando Alonso deserves an honourable mention today after a strong 7th place finish. He controlled his pace so well after the red flag after he made sure to hold his position and hold Hamilton behind him to protect his medium tyres. It was great to see him start to recover his season as he brought home more points for the Alpine team. I think it's also worth a slight honourable mention for Max Verstappen. It was an interesting weekend for the Dutchman as he finished 3rd for the first time since the Portuguese Grand Prix in 2020. To me, it feels like he's just had a bit of an off weekend, which is so rare for a driver that's now one of the most consistent in the sport. The final honourable mention goes to the TV direction, which was just really poor. It felt like the TV team in Monaco, which are independent of the others that travel the world, was just really disappointing. We didn't see overtakes, we didn't see outlaps, and the camera kept jumping between shots. It was just not nice to watch. Let me know what I missed in this chaotic race, and we could see chaos once again in Azerbaijan in just a couple of weeks' time.